My parents thought selling my dead grandfather's farm behind my back would make them millionaires. Instead, it made them federal suspects. The smell of diesel exhaust burned my lungs as I stood in the crisp Illinois air. Exactly 3 feet in front of me, the massive steel tread of a Vanguard Estates bulldozer idled with a deafening roar. It was aimed directly at the oldest heritage apple tree on my grandfather Hank's 300-acre farm. Billionaire developer Victor Price stood a few yards away, waving a fraudulent deed and screaming at me to move, or he'd have me arrested for trespassing. The tension was palpable. The ticking of Hank's vintage pocket watch in my hand seemed to synchronize with the idling engine. The cold metal grounded me against the sheer absurdity of the situation. Before I tell you how a Chicago supply chain analyst ended up playing a game of chicken with a corporate demolition crew, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Zara Told Stories. I'd also love to know, how old are you, and where are you watching this from? 3 weeks prior, the atmosphere was suffocatingly somber at Hank's funeral in central Illinois. The small country church felt crowded mostly with neighbors and other farmers who respected my grandfather. I stood near the back, my eyes fixed on the simple wooden casket. He was the only family member who truly understood me. While my parents, Stephen and Carol, chased corporate status in the Chicago suburbs, I spent my summers learning the agribusiness trade in Hank's fields. I learned the value of a hard day's work and the smell of fresh rain on overturned soil. My parents, however, treated the wake like a networking event. They glided between pews, shaking hands, offering practiced hollow smiles. My brother Tyler, the family's golden child, paraded around in a custom Italian suit he couldn't possibly afford on the income from his string of failed tech startups. He looked entirely out of place, adjusting his silk tie, while local farmers paid their respects in their Sunday best. The real betrayal began after the service, during the reading of the will at the lawyer's office. The lawyer, a man with a tired face and a cheap suit, adjusted his glasses and read from a document that seemed far too brief for a man who had built a 300-acre legacy. According to this will, Hank died penniless. The estate, the farm, the equipment, it was all left to Stephen and Carol to manage the debt. They completely froze me out. My father, Stephen, leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound burden on his face. "It's a lot to take on," he sighed, looking at my mother. "But we'll manage. For Dad." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Hank hadn't been in debt. I knew this because I had been secretly paying his medical bills for years while my parents ignored his calls. I had balanced his books. I knew exactly what that farm was worth. When I asked if I could keep Hank's vintage pocket watch as a memento, a simple token of the summers we spent together, my mother Carol coldly brushed me off. "Don't be dramatic, Emily," she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. She then shoved a dusty cardboard box into my chest. "Here, we saved Hank's junk from the attic. Take it and go back to your little apartment." She didn't look at me as she said it. Her focus was already on the door, eager to leave. I accepted the box quietly. The cardboard was rough against my hands, smelling of dust and old paper. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of them. I took the box, a silent testament to my grandfather's life, and walked out. Hidden at the bottom of that box, beneath old receipts and faded photographs, was a heavy, rusted iron key and the ticking pocket watch. I returned to my Chicago apartment, heartbroken but deeply suspicious of my brother's sudden influx of cash and my parents' chilling lack of grief. To understand how I ended up standing in front of a running demolition vehicle, you have to understand the anatomy of my family's deception. The cracks in their facade began showing exactly 3 weeks prior, during a suffocatingly warm afternoon in a rural Illinois church. The sanctuary smelled of wilted lilies, lemon floor wax, and the damp earth brought in on the boots of local farmers. I stood near the back row, my fingers gripping the edge of a wooden pew until my knuckles turned white. My eyes remained fixed on the simple oak casket at the front of the room. Hank, my grandfather, was the only person in my bloodline who truly knew me. While my parents chased corporate prestige in the manicured suburbs of Chicago, I spent my childhood summers walking those 300 acres of prime riverbed soil. Hank taught me how to read the weather, how to balance an agribusiness ledger, and how to value the quiet dignity of a hard day's work. My parents, Stephen and Carol, possessed no such dignity. They treated my grandfather's wake like a suburban networking mixer. My mother glided between the pews wearing a tailored black dress that looked more suited for a charity gala than a rural funeral. She offered practiced hollow smiles to the locals, shaking hands, while subtly checking her phone every few minutes. My father stood near the entrance, adjusting his silk tie and discussing interest rates with the town mayor. Neither of them shed a single tear. Their grief was a shallow performance, a mandatory obligation they were eager to finish. The real anomaly arrived 20 minutes late. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung open, and my older brother Tyler strolled into the sanctuary. Tyler had always been the golden child, the son who could do no wrong despite a decade of spectacular failures. He had launched 3 different technology startups, and all 3 had crashed, requiring constant financial bailouts from our parents. Yet as he walked down the aisle, he did not look like a man drowning in debt. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped flawlessly over his shoulders. The scent of an expensive imported cologne trailed behind him, overpowering the smell of the funeral flowers. When he reached up to smooth his hair, a heavy gold watch caught the light filtering through the stained glass windows. I recognized the brand. It was a timepiece that repaired for a staggering sum, far beyond the reach of a failed entrepreneur. He stood next to our mother, complaining in a hushed whisper about the dust settling on his polished leather shoes. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in my stomach. Tyler was flaunting a newfound fortune on the exact day we were burying our grandfather. The true depths of their scheme unfolded an hour later, inside a cramped, dusty legal office off the main town square. The attorney, a tired-looking man named Mr. Gable, sat behind a desk piled high with disorganized folders. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed an irritating rhythm. My parents sat in the 2 leather chairs opposite the desk, leaving me to stand by the door. Mr. Gable adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. He picked up a remarkably thin document, a sharp contrast to the towering legacy my grandfather had built. According to this version of the will, Hank died destitute. Mr. Gable read the brief paragraphs aloud, his monotonous voice draining the life from the room. The document claimed the farm was heavily leveraged, drowning in outstanding medical debts and operational deficits. The estate, the land, the equipment, it was all left exclusively to Stephen and Carol to manage the burden of liquidation. I stood perfectly still, my fingernails digging into the palms of my hands. My father leaned back in his leather chair, exhaling a long theatrical sigh. He reached over and patted my mother's hand. He looked at the lawyer with an expression of profound martyrdom. He said it was a heavy burden for the family to take on, but they would manage the debt to honor Hank's memory. I stared at the back of my father's head, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. It was a lie. Hank did not die in debt. I knew this with unassailable certainty because I was the one who had secretly paid his oncology bills for the past 4 years. When my parents ignored his phone calls, claiming they were too busy with corporate retreats, I balanced his operational ledgers. I knew every line item of that farm. The property was free and clear, producing a steady, profitable yield. The narrative my parents were spinning in this dusty office was a calculated fabrication. They were icing me out of the legal proceedings entirely, establishing a narrative of bankruptcy to mask something far more sinister. The tension snapped into open hostility in the gravel parking lot behind the lawyer's office. The autumn wind bit through my thin coat, as I approached my mother before she could get into her luxury sedan. I did not ask for a share of the non-existent debt. I did not ask for money. I simply asked if I could keep Hank's vintage pocket watch. It was a brass timepiece he had carried every single day of my childhood, a symbol of the time we spent walking the fields together. Carol paused, her hand resting on the door handle. She looked at me with an expression of chilling indifference. Her eyes swept over my practical shoes and modest wool coat. She let out a sharp, dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed by my sentimentality. She told me to stop being so dramatic. Reaching into the back seat of her car, she dragged out a battered cardboard box. The sides were frayed, and it smelled faintly of engine grease and old tobacco. She shoved the box into my chest with enough force to make me take a step backward. She said they had cleared out the attic and saved his junk. She told me to take the garbage and go back to my little apartment in the city. Tyler leaned against the hood of his sports car a few feet away, swirling a takeaway coffee cup. He smirked, telling me that a supply chain analyst should know better than to cling to worthless inventory. He laughed at his own joke, the sound cutting through the cold air like a blade. I did not yell. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I gripped the rough cardboard box, feeling the weight of my grandfather's discarded life in my arms, and I walked to my car without looking back. The drive back to Chicago was a blur of highway lines and gray skies. Rain began to strike the windshield, mimicking the steady, relentless drumbeat of my thoughts. Nothing added up. The sudden influx of cash, funding Tyler's bespoke wardrobe and luxury watch, directly contradicted the narrative of a bankrupt estate. My parents' eagerness to assume a mountain of debt defied their lifelong pattern of fierce financial self-preservation. They were hiding a windfall, and they had used a fraudulent will to erase my connection to the property. Night had fallen by the time I carried the box into my downtown apartment. The glow of the city skyline spilled through my windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I set the box on my kitchen island and turned on the overhead light. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled back the folded cardboard flaps. Inside lay a haphazard collection of my grandfather's life: a faded flannel shirt, a pair of scuffed leather work gloves, a stack of old farmers' almanacs. My mother had thrown these items together with zero care, viewing them only as debris to discard. I sifted through the items, the smell of the farm instantly filling my modern kitchen. Beneath a stack of weathered Polaroids, my fingers brushed against a small velvet pouch. The fabric was worn smooth with age. I pulled the drawstring open and emptied the contents onto the granite countertop. 2 items tumbled out, landing with a heavy clink. The first was the brass pocket watch I had asked for. I picked it up, feeling the familiar cold metal against my palm. I turned the small dial at the top, winding the internal spring. A second later, a strong, rhythmic ticking echoed in the quiet apartment. Hank had kept it in perfect working condition. The second item was a heavy, rusted iron key. It was an antique safety deposit key, stamped with a faded serial number and the logo of a small independent rural bank located 2 towns over from the farm. I stared at the key, my analytical mind piecing the puzzle together. Hank was a meticulous man. He never kept valuables in the attic. He would not have left a safety deposit key hidden at the bottom of a box of old clothes unless he intended for it to be found by someone willing to dig through the memories. My mother had unknowingly handed me the exact tool needed to dismantle their lies. I gripped the iron key in my hand, the sharp edges pressing into my skin. The profound grief that had clouded my mind for 3 weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. My parents had sold out my grandfather's legacy to fund their superficial lifestyle, and they had cast me aside, assuming I was too weak to challenge them. They thought I would quietly accept my place in the shadows. They were wrong. I placed the ticking watch and the iron key into my coat pocket. I knew exactly what I had to do. The following morning, I would drive back to the farm to face whatever secrets they had buried in that soil. A week passed. A week of sleepless nights in my Chicago apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the grandfather I loved with the destitute man my parents described. The heavy iron key and the brass pocket watch sat on my bedside table, silent anchors in a sea of confusion. I needed closure. I needed to stand on Hank's land one last time to say a proper goodbye before my parents inevitably sold off the equipment to cover the supposed debts. So on a brisk Tuesday morning, I called in sick to my supply chain firm, grabbed the keys to my sedan, and drove the 3 hours south to the farm. The drive was familiar. A route I could navigate blindfolded, winding past grain silos and endless stretches of cornfields that defined central Illinois. But as I turned onto the dirt driveway leading to the main property, the peaceful silence I expected was shattered. 3 white pickup trucks bearing the logo Vanguard Estates were parked near the barn. A team of men in neon vests were actively driving wooden survey stakes deep into the fertile soil near the riverbed. This wasn't an appraisal or an auction preparation. This was site development. I slammed my car into park and marched toward the group, my boots crunching aggressively against the gravel. I approached a man who appeared to be the foreman. He was studying a set of architectural blueprints spread across the hood of his truck. He didn't look up as I drew near, clearly assuming I was lost or confused. I demanded to know what they were doing on my grandfather's property. He finally adjusted his hard hat, looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and superiority. He informed me in a tone reserved for the painfully uninformed that Vanguard Estates had closed on this parcel 4 days ago. He told me the company paid $4 million for the 300 acres, and they were prepping the site for a luxury subdivision. The air rushed out of my lungs. $4 million. My mind raced backward to that cramped, dusty legal office where my father had sighed heavily about the crushing burden of managing a bankrupt estate. It had been a lie, a carefully orchestrated deception. My parents hadn't been managing debt. They had been expediting a massive real estate transaction. But my analytical training kicked in almost immediately. Something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Real estate transfers of this magnitude required meticulous title searches, probate clearance, and an ironclad chain of ownership. Hank had been dead for less than a month. No legitimate title company would have greenlit a $4 million closing that fast, especially with the murky legal status of a fresh estate. The foreman, misinterpreting my stunned silence as ignorance, pointed to a signature on his work order. He said the previous owners, Stephen and Carol Ferguson, had used a power of attorney to fast-track the sale. My stomach plummeted. I remembered that power of attorney. Hank had signed it over a decade ago when he had a minor heart procedure just in case something went wrong during surgery. He had explicitly revoked it years later, but my parents had clearly kept the original document hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to weaponize it. But how did Vanguard Estates accept it? The answer, I would later learn, was rooted in the ruthless ambition of Vanguard's CEO, Victor Price. Price was a billionaire developer, infamous for steamrolling over legal technicalities. He had caught wind that a rival firm was eyeing the riverbed property for a high-end golf course. Desperate to secure the land before his competitor, Price bypassed external legal counsel. He utilized a corrupt in-house title agent to push the closing through, deliberately turning a blind eye to the glaring red flags on the deed. He accepted the outdated power of attorney without question, prioritizing speed over legality. He assumed that, even if a dispute arose later, his army of corporate lawyers could crush any provincial family squabble. My parents had found the perfect impatient buyer to facilitate their theft. As I stood there, reeling from the magnitude of the betrayal, the low, throbbing hum of a high-performance engine announced a new arrival. A sleek, midnight blue sports car, A model that retailed for well over $150,000, crawled up the rutted driveway, its low undercarriage scraping against the uneven terrain. The tinted window slid down, revealing my brother Tyler. He was wearing designer sunglasses and a smug, satisfied grin. He parked next to the foreman's truck, casually opened the door, and stepped out onto the soil Hank had spent a lifetime cultivating. Tyler took a sip from an artisanal coffee cup, then carelessly tossed the empty container onto the ground. The casual disrespect was staggering. He leaned against the polished hood of his new vehicle, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He asked what I was doing hanging around the old dirt patch. I stared at the expensive car, the bespoke suit, the heavy gold watch he had worn to the funeral. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. This was where the money had gone. I confronted him, my voice steady despite the rage boiling beneath the surface. I asked him if this was his cut of the $4 million our parents had stolen from the estate. Tyler didn't deny it. He didn't even try to soften the blow. He laughed a harsh, dismissive sound. He openly boasted about his newfound wealth. He proudly declared that our parents had split the windfall with him to fund his new lifestyle brand, an enterprise he claimed would revolutionize the wellness industry, despite his track record of catastrophic business failures. He told me that Stephen and Carol recognized his potential and wanted to invest in a real future, unlike my dead-end corporate job. I asked him how they could justify cutting me out entirely. I asked how they could sell the land Hank loved without so much as a conversation. Tyler adjusted his sunglasses, his smile fading into a cold sneer. He delivered a line that cut deeper than any physical blow could have. He told me that our parents viewed me as an inconvenient afterthought. They knew I would have ruined the deal with my sentimental nonsense about preserving the farm. He explicitly stated that they engineered the fake will reading to keep me quiet until the check cleared. He looked at me not as a sister, but as a minor obstacle they had successfully bypassed. I looked at Tyler then, at the surveyors hammering stakes into the riverbed. My parents and my brother hadn't just stolen a piece of property. They had executed a coordinated financial heist designed to enrich their favorite child while erasing my existence from Hank's legacy entirely. They believed they were untouchable, protected by a billionaire developer's dirty money and a fraudulent legal document. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the rusted iron key and the brass pocket watch. The ticking seemed to grow louder, a rhythmic reminder of my grandfather's meticulous nature. They thought I was discarded. They were about to find out exactly how much damage an inconvenient afterthought could inflict. I left the farm with the sound of my brother's cruel laughter ringing in my ears, blending with the rhythmic thud of the survey stakes being driven into my grandfather's legacy. The 2-hour drive north to my parents' upscale suburb of Naperville passed in a haze of cold, hardening fury. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands ached, replaying Tyler's words. An inconvenient afterthought. That was how the people who raised me viewed my entire existence. They hadn't just sold a piece of real estate. They had executed a calculated erasure of my childhood, assuming I would simply fade into the background. My parents lived in a sprawling, meticulously manicured colonial house that looked like a spread from an architectural magazine. The kind of neighborhood where appearances were everything and emotional depth was a liability. I parked my modest sedan behind my mother's luxury SUV, killed the engine, and took a slow, steadying breath. In my right coat pocket, my fingers curled around the rusted iron key. In my left, Hank's brass pocket watch ticked with a reassuring, mechanical heartbeat. I didn't knock. I bypassed the front door and walked around to the expansive backyard patio, knowing their afternoon routine. I found Stephen and Carol sitting on designer wicker furniture, basking in the mild autumn sun. A silver ice bucket sat between them, chilling an expensive bottle of champagne. 2 crystal flutes caught the afternoon light. They were celebrating. They were actively toasting the fraudulent liquidation of my grandfather's life while the ink on the deed was still drying. My mother noticed me first. She didn't look startled, merely inconvenienced, as if a door-to-door salesperson had interrupted her leisure time. She set her flute down with a delicate clink against the glass table. She asked, her tone dripping with manufactured patience, why I hadn't called before dropping by. My father barely glanced up from his tablet, taking a slow sip of his drink. He suggested, without a trace of warmth, that I should have let them know I was coming so they could have ordered an extra salad for lunch. I walked to the edge of the patio, standing over them. I didn't offer a greeting. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I looked directly at Stephen and asked him how much Vanguard Estates had paid for Hank's soul. The silence that followed was sharp and immediate. My father lowered his tablet, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. The performative martyrdom he had displayed in the lawyer's office was gone, replaced by the ruthless corporate executive he truly was. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He set his champagne down, leaned forward, and delivered a line designed to crush me completely. He told me I needed to stop pretending I was some sort of tragic heiress. He said the farm was never really mine to begin with. He looked at me, his own daughter, and stated that I was nothing more than the hired help Hank used during the summer months. He claimed they had done the family a favor by liquidating a toxic asset before it drained their finances. Carol chimed in, her voice smooth and venomous. She assumed my presence was a pathetic attempt at extortion. She miscalculated my motives entirely, believing this was a negotiation. She accused me of tracking them down to beg for a 25% cut of the $4 million. She laughed, a high, brittle sound that echoed across the manicured lawn. She mocked my supply chain analyst's salary, suggesting I was desperate enough to try and shake down my own family for a slice of their hard-earned inheritance. They thought they had me figured out. They believed I was the weak, sentimental daughter here to cry and plead for a handout. Stephen picked up his crystal flute, swirling the expensive liquid. He advised me, in a tone dripping with condescension, to go back to my little apartment in the city and accept my place in the world. He warned me that if I tried to hire a bargain basement lawyer to contest the sale, he would drag the proceedings out for a decade until I was bankrupt. Carol took it a step further. She pulled her phone from her designer handbag and threatened to call the local police, claiming I was trespassing and harassing them on private property. I stood perfectly still on their pristine patio. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my coffee cup like Tyler had done. I didn't let a single tear fall. I absorbed their arrogance, their cruel assumptions, and their hollow threats. The ticking of Hank's pocket watch served as a metronome pacing my reaction. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the tension. I looked at the people who were supposed to protect me. The people who had just admitted to orchestrating a massive financial theft, and I realized they were fundamentally empty. They worshipped status and money above all else, leaving no room for loyalty or love. They smugly believed they had won the chess match, confident that their billionaire buyer and fraudulent paperwork made them untouchable. They thought I was there to beg for a fraction of the pie. I didn't say a single word. I simply turned on my heel, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and walked back to my car. I left them sitting on their designer furniture, sipping champagne, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. I had no intention of asking for a 25% cut. I was going back to Chicago to legally seize the entire bakery, and I was going to use the key they threw away to lock them inside their own trap. The drive back to Chicago felt entirely different than the journey down. My hands, which had gripped the steering wheel so tightly on the way to Naperville, now rested lightly against the leather. The fury that had propelled me onto my parents' patio had crystallized into something sharper and much more focused. The ticking of Hank's pocket watch in my coat pocket seemed to echo the methodical beat of my own heart. They had sold the land, yes, but they had also handed me a key. A heavy, rusted piece of iron discarded as junk. The moment I stepped into my apartment, I pulled the key from my pocket and set it under the bright beam of a desk lamp. The metal was cold-pitted with age and oxidation. Yet, embossed along the thick shaft were a series of faded numbers and a distinct, stylized logo. A single sheaf of wheat bracketed by two curving lines. It took an hour of searching through regional archives and agricultural banking registries to match the logo. It belonged to the First Farmers Bank of Ogle County, a small independent institution located 2 towns over from Hank's property. The bank had stubbornly resisted corporate buyouts for a century, catering specifically to generational farmers who preferred face-to-face handshakes over digital portals. Hank had banked there his entire life. The realization washed over me with undeniable force. He hadn't kept a safety deposit box at the major branch in town, where my parents paid his utility bills. He had maintained a secret vault in a neighboring county, far away from their prying eyes. The following morning, I called in sick for the second day in a row. I drove straight back down the interstate, the autumn landscape blurring past my windows. The First Farmers Bank of Ogle County was exactly as I had imagined. A sturdy brick building that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1970s. The teller, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Martha, recognized me instantly. She told me I had my grandfather's smile. She didn't ask for explanations or offer empty condolences. She simply accepted the key, checked my identification against a meticulously kept ledger, and led me into a quiet, wood-paneled room. She handed me a long metal box, nodded once, and closed the door behind her. I sat at a small oak table, the silence in the room absolute. My fingers traced the rusted metal of the lockbox before I opened the lid. Inside, there was no jewelry, no stacks of cash, no sentimental trinkets. There was only a single, thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. I broke the seal. The paper inside was crisp and heavy, filled with dense legal terminology. On top of the stack sat a handwritten letter. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Hank's, tight, precise, and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was brief but devastating. Hank wrote that he had watched Stephen and Carol prioritize status over substance for 3 decades. He knew with absolute certainty that the moment his heart stopped, they would liquidate the riverbed soil to fund their superficial lives. He wrote that he refused to let a century of our family's sweat be paved over for a subdivision. He ended the letter by telling me that the land had always been mine. He said I was the only one who understood the true value of the earth, not the price tag attached to it. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the faded ink. The grief I had suppressed for weeks finally broke, not in jagged sobs, but in a quiet, overwhelming wave of love and vindication. Hank had seen me. He had always seen me. He had known my parents' true nature and had taken steps to protect the one thing he cherished most. I wiped my eyes and turned my attention to the legal documents beneath the letter. The paperwork was an irrevocable trust agreement drafted and finalized 5 years prior. The terms were unambiguous. Hank had transferred the title of the entire 300-acre farm into the trust. The document explicitly named me, Emily Ferguson, as the sole beneficiary and the absolute legal owner of the estate upon his passing. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. The power of attorney my parents had used to execute the sale was a worthless piece of paper. The legal authority it granted evaporated the very second Hank drew his final breath. Stephen and Carol had zero legal right to sign those closing documents. They had sold land they did not own to a billionaire developer. Vanguard Estates had wired $4 million into the accounts of fraudsters. I needed a shark. I needed a lawyer who wouldn't flinch at taking down a corporate giant and a toxic family simultaneously. I packed the documents back into the lockbox, thanked Martha, and drove straight back to Chicago, bypassing my apartment entirely. My destination was the financial district, specifically the towering glass skyscraper that housed Grant and Associates. Mitchell Grant was a legend in agricultural law. He was ruthless, brilliant, and notoriously expensive. He specialized in untangling complex land disputes and taking down corporate conglomerates that tried to steamroll independent farmers. I had read about him in industry journals during my supply chain analysis research. He was not a man who took walk-in appointments, but I didn't care. I marched into his pristine reception area, clutching the manila envelope against my chest. The receptionist tried to dismiss me, citing Mitchell's packed schedule. I bypassed her desk and walked directly toward the corner office. Mitchell stood behind his mahogany desk, a phone pressed to his ear, his expression a mask of intense irritation. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. He ended his call abruptly when I entered, demanding to know how I had bypassed security. I didn't offer an apology. I slapped the irrevocable trust agreement down on the center of his desk. I told him my parents had just sold a 300-acre farm to Vanguard Estates for $4 million, using an outdated power of attorney. I told him the developer was currently driving stakes into protected riverbed soil. Then I pointed to the trust document and told him I was the actual legal owner of that land. Mitchell's irritation vanished. He picked up the heavy legal document, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs with terrifying speed. The silence in the office stretched thick and charged with electricity. He flipped to the signature page, examining the notary stamps and the dates. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, then turned back to face me. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He confirmed my analysis. The sale was a catastrophic legal failure. He explained that Vanguard Estates had bypassed a comprehensive title search, likely relying on a corrupt internal agent to expedite the acquisition. He stated that the $4 million transaction wasn't merely a breach of contract. It was textbook federal wire fraud. My parents had knowingly signed closing documents, asserting ownership they did not possess. Mitchell leaned against his desk, the predatory smile widening. He told me I wasn't just a discarded daughter anymore. He told me I was a multi-millionaire landowner who held the power to destroy a billionaire's development project and send my family to federal prison. The revelation hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I was no longer the inconvenient afterthought. I was the architect of their impending ruin. But Mitchell warned me that the clock was ticking. Vanguard Estates moved fast. If those bulldozers poured a single yard of concrete, the heritage soil would be permanently sacred, and the legal battle would become exponentially more difficult. We needed to strike immediately. He reached for his phone, his voice sharp and commanding, instructing his paralegals to draft an emergency injunction. The battle for Hank's legacy had officially begun. Mitchell Grant did not waste a single second after reviewing the irrevocable trust. The atmosphere in his corner office shifted from quiet contemplation to high-stakes legal warfare in the blink of an eye. He leaned across his mahogany desk, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. He spelled out the reality of the situation with brutal clarity. Vanguard Estates had bypassed standard due diligence, eager to secure prime Illinois riverbed property before their competitors. In their haste, they had wired $4 million into the accounts of fraudsters. My parents, Stephen and Carol, had knowingly signed closing documents asserting ownership they did not possess. It was a textbook case of federal wire fraud. However, Mitchell emphasized that a legal victory on paper meant nothing if the physical land was destroyed. Victor Price, the ruthless billionaire CEO of Vanguard Estates, was infamous for moving faster than the courts. He operated under the strategy of asking for forgiveness rather than permission, knowing his army of corporate lawyers could usually outlast any opposition. If Price's demolition crews poured a single yard of concrete, if they contaminated the rich topsoil Hank had spent his life cultivating, the heritage farm would be permanently scarred. We had the law on our side, but Price had the bulldozers. The race was on. Mitchell turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. He began drafting an emergency ex parte injunction, a legal maneuver designed to halt all activity on the property immediately, without requiring a prior hearing from the opposing party. He explained that this was our only chance to stop Vanguard in their tracks. As he typed, he instructed his paralegals over the intercom to prepare the necessary filing fees and to secure a runner to expedite the documents to the county courthouse. I paced the length of his office, the adrenaline surging through my veins. The transition from a discarded, grieving daughter to a multi-millionaire landowner fighting a corporate giant was dizzying. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Chicago skyline, the towering glass and steel monuments to ambition and power. I was about to unleash a storm that would tear through this very city, starting with Victor Price's development empire and ending with my own family's financial destruction. The rusted iron key and the ticking pocket watch in my coat pocket felt like physical anchors in a rapidly spinning world. Just as Mitchell hit print on the injunction documents, my cell phone began to vibrate violently. The caller ID flashed the name Arthur Miller, a neighboring farmer whose land bordered Hank's property. Arthur and Hank had been friends for decades, often sharing equipment and complaining about fluctuating crop prices over morning coffee. I answered the call, my heart dropping into my stomach. Arthur's voice was frantic, breathless with exertion. He shouted over the line, struggling to be heard above a deafening mechanical roar in the background. He told me that a fleet of Vanguard Estates demolition vehicles had just arrived at the farm. They were supposed to start prep work next week, but Price had moved the schedule up. They were already tearing down the old wooden fences and were lining up their heavy machinery near the east field. The east field was where Hank had planted the heritage apple orchard over 20 years ago, a living monument to his dedication to the land. Arthur warned me that if I didn't get down there right now, the entire orchard would be leveled before lunch. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through the adrenaline. I hung up the phone and relayed the terrifying news to Mitchell. The corporate shark didn't flinch. He grabbed the freshly printed injunction off his desk, shoved it into a leather briefcase, and threw his tailored jacket over his shoulder. He told me to get in my car and drive straight to the farm. He promised he would get a judge to sign the order and meet me there as fast as legally possible. We were playing a dangerous game of chicken, pitting a fragile piece of paper against tons of hardened steel. I bolted out of the law firm, bypassing the elevators and taking the stairs 2 at a time. I threw myself into my modest sedan, the engine roaring to life as I navigated the chaotic downtown traffic. The drive down Interstate 55 was a blur of frantic lane changes and white-knuckle tension. The speedometer hovered dangerously close to the triple digits, but I didn't care. I was racing against time, against the destruction of my grandfather's legacy, against the arrogance of a billionaire who thought he could pave over a century of history without consequence. The familiar landscape of central Illinois whipped past my windows. The sprawling cornfields and grain silos, a stark contrast to the concrete jungle I had just fled. But as I neared the county line, the serene agricultural scenery gave way to a scene of corporate aggression. Dust billowed into the crisp autumn air, a thick, suffocating cloud that choked the horizon. I could hear the deep, rumbling growl of heavy machinery long before I turned onto the dirt driveway leading to the main property. The serene sanctuary of my childhood was gone, replaced by a chaotic construction zone. The old wooden fences that Hank had meticulously painted every spring were reduced to splintered kindling. 3 massive excavators were tearing into the earth near the barn, their metal claws ripping deep gashes into the fertile soil. But the most terrifying sight was positioned near the east field. A colossal Vanguard Estates bulldozer, its steel treads gleaming in the morning sun, was idling menacingly. It was positioned exactly 3 feet in front of the oldest heritage apple tree on the property, the very tree Hank and I had planted together when I was a little girl. The driver, wearing a neon vest and a hard hat, was revving the engine, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath my feet. Standing a few yards away, directing the destruction with a dismissive wave of his hand, was Victor Price himself. He wore a designer cashmere coat over a tailored suit, looking entirely out of place amidst the diesel fumes and flying dirt. He held a rolled-up set of blueprints like a weapon, his face set in a mask of impatient arrogance. He viewed this land not as a legacy, but as a blank canvas for generic suburban McMansions, a stepping stone to his next $1 billion. I slammed my car into park, ignoring the furious honking of a passing dump truck. I leaped out, the cold Illinois air biting against my face. I didn't hesitate. I didn't calculate the risk. I ran straight toward the east field, my boots pounding against the uneven terrain. I threw myself directly into the path of the colossal machine, placing my body between the roaring steel treads and the fragile, ancient apple tree. The driver slammed on the brakes, the massive bulldozer skidding to a halt mere inches from my trembling form. The sudden silence was almost as deafening as the engine's roar. A thick cloud of dust enveloped us, stinging my eyes and coating the back of my throat. I stood perfectly still, my chest heaving with exertion, the ticking of Hank's vintage pocket watch in my hand, synchronizing with my racing heartbeat. Victor Price marched toward me, his face turning a furious shade of red. He waved the fraudulent deed in my face, screaming that I was trespassing on private property, threatening to have me arrested if I didn't move immediately. The high-stakes standoff had reached its breaking point. I was a Chicago supply chain analyst, playing a game of chicken with a corporate demolition crew. I looked the billionaire dead in the eye, my gaze unwavering, waiting for the cavalry to arrive, praying that Mitchell Grant drove as fast as he navigated the law. The suffocating scent of diesel fuel coated the back of my throat, thick and heavy in the crisp autumn air. I stood anchored in the loose, fertile soil, staring down the painted yellow grill of the towering earth mover. The enormous steel treads were mere feet from my boots. The driver killed the forward momentum, but left the colossal engine running, sending fierce, rhythmic vibrations up through the soles of my shoes. My fingers traced the smooth brass casing of my grandfather's pocket watch inside my coat pocket, feeling the steady, mechanical heartbeat ticking against my palm. My training as a supply chain analyst had taught me how to manage chaotic variables under extreme pressure, but nothing could have prepared me for this specific type of confrontation. I focused on my breathing, matching the rhythm to the ticking watch, refusing to let my panic show on my face. Looming right behind me was the oldest heritage apple tree on the estate. This was not just a piece of timber or random foliage. This was the exact spot where Hank had taught me how to graft branches during a bitter frost when I was a little girl. We had spent countless hours wrapped in heavy blankets, nursing the roots back to health, ensuring it would bear fruit for another generation. It was a living monument to his dedication, a testament to resilience. To Victor Price, it was merely an inconvenient piece of organic debris standing in the way of a paved cul-de-sac. Victor Price did not like being defied. A man accustomed to pristine boardrooms and instant compliance, he stormed across the uneven dirt, his expensive Italian loafers kicking up small clouds of dust. He operated under a simple, ruthless philosophy: buy the land, pave over the history, and ask for legal forgiveness later. Beside him walked a local county sheriff, a burly man with a weathered face and a brass star pinned to his uniform chest. The officer looked deeply uncomfortable, recognizing me as Hank's granddaughter, a familiar face in a town that respected heritage over fast cash. Price pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, shouting over the deafening roar of the idling machinery. He ordered the officer to remove me from the premises immediately. He claimed I was a deranged trespasser, interfering with a lawful corporate construction project. The sheriff approached, his expression weary and conflicted. He unhooked the metal handcuffs from his utility belt, the sound of clinking steel cutting through the mechanical noise. He warned me that I needed to step aside or face immediate detainment. He said he did not want to arrest me, but the developer possessed the legal right-of-way. I held my ground. The urge to run fought a desperate battle against my instinct to protect my grandfather's legacy. I looked the sheriff in the eye and stated with unwavering clarity that I was standing on my own property. Price let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He unfolded a crisp sheet of paper and shoved his fraudulent deed toward the officer, declaring he had purchased the 300 acres 4 days prior. He sneered, telling me that my sentimental attachment did not overrule a $4 million transaction. Just as the sheriff reached out to grasp my wrist, a sleek black sedan tore down the gravel driveway. The vehicle fishtailed slightly before skidding to a halt near the construction perimeter, sending a shower of pebbles against the side of a nearby pickup truck. The driver's side door flew open, and out stepped Mitchell Grant. The high-stakes agricultural attorney looked entirely out of his element on a dusty farm, wearing a bespoke navy suit and polished Oxfords. Yet, he carried an aura of undeniable authority. He did not rush. He walked with the measured, predatory stride of a man holding all the winning cards. He held a thick leather briefcase in one hand and a court-stamped document in the other. Mitchell positioned himself smoothly between the sheriff and me. He adjusted his tie, unbothered by the diesel exhaust, and extended the document toward the officer. He announced in a voice that cut through the engine noise like a sharpened blade that he was presenting an emergency ex parte injunction signed by a superior court judge 15 minutes ago. He instructed the sheriff to stand down. Price snatched the paper from the air before the officer could take it. He scoffed, claiming his legal team would have the injunction thrown out before lunch. He boasted about buying the land in good faith, but as his eyes scanned the dense legal text, the smug superiority vanished from his features. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He read the terms of the irrevocable trust outlined in the judicial order, his jaw tightening as he reached the paragraphs invalidating the power of attorney. Mitchell did not give the billionaire a chance to recover. He leaned in, speaking with icy precision. He informed Price that Vanguard Estates had bypassed standard due diligence to fast-track a land grab. In doing so, the company had wired $4 million to individuals who possessed zero legal claim to the title. Mitchell dismantled the concept of good faith, explaining that ignoring glaring red flags on a title transfer negated any corporate protection. He laid bare the reality of the situation. My parents had committed federal wire fraud, and Price was currently standing on land legally owned by the woman he was trying to arrest. Furthermore, Mitchell pointed toward the heavy machinery and warned that the demolition crew was actively committing unauthorized destruction of private property. Every second those engines remained running, the financial penalties against Vanguard Estates multiplied. The sheriff leaned over, reading the judge's signature and the official county seal on the injunction. His demeanor shifted instantly, a wave of profound relief washing over his weathered face. He unhanded his cuffs, clipping them back onto his belt, and took a deliberate step away from Price. The officer looked up at the bulldozer driver and made a sharp, sweeping motion across his throat. The driver reached down and killed the ignition. The sudden silence that descended upon the east field was staggering. The deafening roar of the engine died, replaced by the gentle sound of autumn wind rustling through the leaves of the ancient apple tree. The air cleared of diesel smoke. The power dynamic on the dirt field inverted with dizzying speed. A billionaire developer, accustomed to buying whatever he wanted, was left holding a worthless piece of paper, having just realized he handed millions of dollars to con artists. Price lowered the document, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and dawning panic. He looked at me, seeing me for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as the undisputed owner of the soil beneath his expensive shoes. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between us. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered 4 words with unwavering certainty. Get off my land. Price opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the sheriff, who simply nodded toward the road, confirming my legal authority. The corporate giant was forced to retreat. He signaled his foreman, his movements stiff and furious. The construction crew began climbing into their trucks, the excavators rolling backward, retreating down the dirt driveway they had invaded only hours ago. I watched the caravan of white trucks disappear over the horizon, the dust settling back onto the quiet earth. I had saved the farm, but the war was far from over. As Price climbed into his luxury SUV, I saw him pull out his cell phone, his face twisted in a mask of pure fury. He was calling his corporate legal team to freeze the fraudulent transaction. My parents and my brother thought they had secured a lifetime of wealth. They were currently spending money that no longer existed, blissfully unaware that a billionaire's wrath was about to crash down upon them and trigger a federal financial freeze that would shatter their arrogant reality. The retreat of the billionaire developer from my grandfather's soil did not signal a truce. It marked the ignition of a silent, devastating corporate retaliation. Victor Price was a man who built an empire on swift, uncompromising vengeance. The second his luxury SUV hit the paved highway, he unleashed a legion of corporate attorneys. Their directive was singular and ruthless. They were to locate, freeze, and seize every single penny Vanguard Estates had wired for that fraudulent transaction. Within hours, emergency litigation was filed in the federal courts of Illinois. The speed of the corporate machine was terrifying. A judge reviewed the irrefutable evidence of the bogus power of attorney and signed a sweeping asset freeze. The digital guillotine dropped. Across the banking networks, algorithms flagged the routing numbers belonging to Stephen Carroll and Tyler Ferguson. Accounts were locked, lines of credit were severed. Wealth evaporated into thin air, leaving only the terrifying specter of federal indictments in its wake. Miles away from the diesel fumes of the farm, my brother Tyler sat perched on a leather stool at an exclusive country club in the Chicago suburbs. The ambient noise of clinking crystal and hushed, wealthy conversations provided the perfect backdrop for his towering hubris. Tyler held court among a group of elite, aspiring venture capitalists. He swirled a heavy glass of top-tier bourbon, the amber liquid catching the soft light of the mahogany bar. He wore his bespoke charcoal suit like a suit of armor, radiating a false, unearned superiority. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, spinning a spectacular fabrication. He regaled his peers with a tale of his own unparalleled business acumen. He claimed he had just single-handedly brokered a monumental real estate deal, outsmarting a major developer to secure a $4 million payout. His friends leaned in, their eyes wide with envy and admiration. Tyler basked in their reverence. He raised his glass to propose a toast to his own genius, offering to cover the exorbitant bar tab for the entire group. It was a scene of profound dramatic irony. The audience of his peers saw a titan of industry at the peak of his success. I knew, and the silent banking algorithms knew, that he was a hollow fraud whose entire reality was currently disintegrating. The invisible digital locks snapped shut on his routing numbers at the exact moment he signaled the bartender for the check. The bartender, a seasoned professional in a crisp white shirt, presented the leather booklet containing a bill that equaled a month of rent for an average person. Tyler did not even look at the total. He casually tossed a sleek metal premium credit card onto the tray, continuing his boastful narrative without missing a beat. The bartender walked away, swiped the card through the terminal, and frowned. A few minutes later, the bartender returned. He leaned over the polished wood of the bar, keeping his voice discreetly low to spare the patron any embarrassment. He politely informed Tyler that the card had been declined. Tyler stopped mid-sentence. A flicker of irritation crossed his features, quickly masked by an arrogant scoff. He loudly blamed a banking error, claiming the fraud department must have flagged the card due to his recent extravagant spending habits. His friends chuckled, accepting the excuse as a common nuisance of the ultra-wealthy. Tyler reached into his designer leather wallet and produced a secondary card, a platinum-tier account he had opened just days prior. The bartender swiped the second card. The terminal issued a harsh, unforgiving beep. Declined. The polite smile faded from the bartender's face. The hushed conversations around the group began to falter. The other patrons at the bar turned their heads, their attention drawn by the sudden, palpable tension. Tyler's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. He snatched the metal card from the leather tray, his hands trembling slightly. The illusion of his limitless wealth was cracking under the fluorescent lights of the payment terminal. Muttering a string of curses aimed at his banking institution, Tyler announced he needed to step outside to call his wealth manager and clear up the ridiculous misunderstanding. He told his friends to order another round on him, promising to return in 5 minutes. He turned on his heel and strode out of the lounge, his pace hurried, desperate to escape the suffocating humiliation of a declined transaction. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of the country club, stepping out into the cool evening air under the expansive portico. He reached into his pocket for his phone, ready to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse on a customer service representative, but the angry words died in his throat before he could dial a single digit. Parked directly in front of the club entrance blocking the valet lane was a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck. The flashing yellow lights cast long, ominous shadows across the pristine pavement. A burly repossession agent in a stained jacket was securing thick metal chains around the axles of Tyler's midnight blue sports car. The $150,000 vehicle was already hoisted onto the steel ramp. Tyler froze the phone, slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the concrete. He sprinted toward the tow truck, his bespoke suit restricting his movements. He shouted at the agent, demanding he unhook the vehicle, screaming that there had been a monumental mistake. He claimed he had paid cash for the down payment, and the financing was flawless. The repo agent did not stop working. He secured the final winch, wiped his greasy hands on a rag, and turned to face my brother. The man pulled a clipboard from his jacket and handed a carbon copy document to Tyler. The agent explained, his tone bored and mechanical, that the primary financial institution had issued an immediate seizure order. The funds used for the down payment had been flagged in a federal wire fraud investigation, rendering the financing contract null and void. The dealership was reclaiming their asset. Tyler stared at the yellow paper, his breathing turning into shallow, rapid gasps. He looked up, his eyes darting toward the glass facade of the country club. Standing on the other side of the floor-to-ceiling windows, peering out into the twilight, were his elite friends. They were watching the entire spectacle. They watched the tow truck driver climb into the cab. They watched the hydraulic lift raise the sports car into the air. They watched Tyler, the self-proclaimed real estate titan, standing on the curb with a declined credit card and a repossession notice in his shaking hands. His social standing, his unearned pride, and his fake empire were shattered in front of the very audience he had so desperately tried to impress. Across town, a similar scene of fiscal devastation was unfolding in the upscale suburbs of Naperville. Stephen and Carol were sitting in the plush office of a luxury travel agency, sipping sparkling water. They were attempting to book a month-long first-class European vacation to celebrate their newfound fortune. The travel agent, a woman with a practiced smile, typed their information into her booking system. When she attempted to run the initial deposit, the system locked her out entirely. She tried a different routing number provided by my father. The screen flashed a stark red warning code. The agent looked up, her smile replaced by a look of deep concern. She turned the monitor around so Stephen could see the screen. The financial institution had placed a hard freeze on all linked assets under federal order. The smug superiority my parents had displayed on their patio just days prior evaporated. The champagne toasts and the arrogant dismissals were replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing dread. Stephen pulled out his cell phone, his fingers numb, and dialed his private banking liaison. The call went straight to an automated message stating that the accounts were under review by federal authorities and all inquiries must be directed to a legal representative. The travel agency office felt like a shrinking cage. The wealth they had stolen to elevate their status had become the exact mechanism of their impending ruin. They rushed out of the building, the crisp autumn air offering no relief to the suffocating panic seizing their lungs. They needed a miracle. They needed an airtight legal defense. Most importantly, they realized there was only one person on Earth who held the key to untangling the catastrophic web they had woven. They had to pivot their desperation toward the daughter they had cruelly discarded. The time for arrogance had passed. The time for groveling was about to begin. My Chicago apartment was a sanctuary of glass and polished steel, perched high above the frantic rhythm of the city. After the adrenaline of the farm standoff and the swift legal maneuvers orchestrated with Mitchell, the quiet hum of the refrigerator felt like a profound luxury. I poured a glass of cold water, watching the condensation bead on the surface, letting my racing heart rate finally settle. The digital clock on the microwave read 8 in the evening. I assumed the dust was settling across the state. I underestimated the sheer, unbridled desperation of cornered animals. A frantic, erratic pounding echoed through the hallway, vibrating against my heavy oak front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic hammering of someone whose entire reality was collapsing. I set the glass down, the sharp clink breaking the silence of my kitchen. I walked slowly to the entryway and peered through the brass peephole. Standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor were my parents and my brother. The visual transformation was staggering. Gone was the bespoke tailoring, the pristine grooming, and the smug champagne-sipping superiority they had weaponized just days prior. Stephen's silk tie was pulled loose, his collar wrinkled, his face marked by dark, exhausted shadows that aged him a decade. Carol's immaculate hair looked unkempt, her designer coat hastily thrown over her shoulders, her posture hunched and fragile. Tyler looked the worst of all. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting up and down the hall like a hunted fugitive. The public repossession of his sports car and the sudden freeze on his elite lifestyle had clearly shattered his fragile ego. I unbolted the deadbolt and opened the door just a few inches, keeping my hand firmly gripped on the handle. I did not invite them inside. I stood in the threshold, presenting a firm physical barrier between my quiet sanctuary and their self-inflicted chaos. Carol pushed forward her hands, trembling as she reached for the wooden doorframe. Tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark streaks across her pale skin. She sobbed a high-pitched, theatrical sound that might have broken my resolve a month ago. She pleaded with me to let them in, claiming they were terrified. She choked on her words, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of federal prosecutors, impending prison sentences, and the total seizure of their suburban assets. She begged for mercy, acting as though a cruel twist of fate had victimized them rather than their own deliberate fraud. Stephen reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. His hands shook as he offered the thick paper toward me. He explained, his voice stripped of its usual booming corporate authority, that his attorney had drafted a retroactive quitclaim deed in a panic. He begged me to sign it. He asked me to backdate my signature to the day before the Vanguard Estate's closing. He promised that if I legitimized the sale, they would split the $4 million with me evenly. He swore things would be different, that they realized the error of their ways, that we could be a real family again. I stared at the trembling paper, my analytical mind dissecting the sheer audacity of the request. They were not asking for forgiveness. They were asking for a willing accomplice. Backdating a legal document to validate a fraudulent land transfer was perjury. It was a felony. They were literally asking me to risk my own freedom, to place my name on a forged timeline just to shield them from the severe consequences of their greed. When I did not reach for the pen, Tyler shoved his way forward, his panic manifested as a twisted, frantic sense of entitlement. He leaned into the doorway, his breath smelling faintly of stale alcohol and nervous sweat. He demanded I stop being stubborn and vindictive. He wielded the concept of family duty like a blunt instrument, insisting that blood required me to save them from ruin. Then he attempted a staggering feat of psychological manipulation. Tyler claimed Hank was losing his mind in those final years. He insisted the irrevocable trust was a tragic mistake made by a senile old man who did not understand the modern economy. He looked me dead in the eye and said Hank would have wanted the family to have the payout. He argued that selling the land to Victor Price was the only logical choice to secure our collective futures. He tried to overwrite my cherished memories of my sharp, meticulous grandfather with a convenient, insulting fiction. I let the silence stretch out, absorbing their desperate, pathetic performance. I felt no pity. I looked at my father, remembering the cold, callous sneer he wore on his sun-drenched patio when he thought he held all the power. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away all emotion to deliver pure, unvarnished truth. I reminded Stephen of his own decree. I repeated his words slowly, letting them echo in the quiet hallway. I told him I was just the hired help. I asked him why the hired help would need to sign a quitclaim deed for an estate that was never really mine to begin with. Stephen opened his mouth, stammering, searching for a defense that did not exist. I looked at Carol, whose tears were still flowing, and then at Tyler, whose jaw was clenched tight with anxiety. I informed them that signing that paper was a federal crime. I stated clearly that I would not commit perjury, I would not validate their theft, and I would certainly not risk a prison sentence to rescue the people who tried to erase me from my grandfather's legacy. The shift was instantaneous. The moment they realized their manipulation had failed, the remorse evaporated like water on a hot stove. Carol's sobbing stopped abruptly. Her tears dried as her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The terrified, weeping mother vanished, replaced by a vicious, cornered predator. She hissed that I was a bitter, ungrateful child, destroying my own flesh and blood over a patch of useless dirt. Stephen stepped closer, his exhaustion morphing into a cold, terrifying rage. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, dropping the victim act entirely. He spat that I had orchestrated this entire nightmare just to humiliate them. He threatened to drag Hank's name through the mud in civil court, promising to tie the trust up in endless litigation until I could not afford to keep the lights on in my apartment. Tyler did not yell. His reaction was far more disturbing. He stared at me with dead, hollow eyes, his breathing ragged and uneven. He muttered a chilling promise under his breath, vowing that I would deeply regret turning my back on them when they needed me most. His gaze dropped from my face to the brass lock on my door, a dark, calculating gleam flickering in his eyes. I did not engage with their venom. I did not need to shout to win the argument. The truth was a shield they could not pierce with their insults. I looked at the three strangers standing in my hallway, feeling a profound, liberating sense of detachment. I told them to direct all future communication to Mitchell Grant. Then I firmly pushed the heavy oak door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a satisfying metallic finality. Muffled curses echoed through the thick wood, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps retreating down the corridor. I leaned against the door, the cool surface grounding me. I had severed the toxic tether. However, as I walked back into my living room, I remembered the chilling, calculated way Tyler had stared at my front lock. The golden child had lost his fortune, his sports car, and his pride. A man with nothing left to lose was a highly unpredictable variable. I knew with unsettling certainty that my brother was not done trying to take what he believed was rightfully his. I did not sleep after locking my family out of my apartment. My mind, trained to identify vulnerabilities in global supply networks, immediately flagged a critical security risk standing right outside my threshold. Tyler had stared at my deadbolt with the hollow, frantic gaze of a man stripped of his safety nets. Growing up, my brother never earned his victories. Whenever he encountered an obstacle, he circumvented the rules, confident our parents would smooth over the collateral damage. Now, facing federal fraud charges and public humiliation, he was desperate. Desperate men make catastrophic mistakes. By dawn, I had contracted a premium locksmith to reinforce my entry points with heavy-duty steel strikes and a keypad deadbolt. More importantly, I utilized overnight delivery to acquire 3 discrete, high-definition security cameras. I positioned them perfectly. One monitored the main hallway, another covered the living space, and the final lens focused directly on the fireproof lockbox tucked onto the top shelf of my bedroom closet. That lockbox held nothing but old tax returns and expired passports. To a frantic mind, however, it looked like a treasure chest hiding a multi-million-dollar trust document. 2 days later, I sat at my sleek desk in the downtown logistics firm where I worked. The ambient noise of clicking keyboards and hushed phone calls provided a rhythmic backdrop to my morning. I was running predictive models for a commercial shipping route, projecting delay probabilities across the Pacific Ocean. My professional life required calculated precision, a stark contrast to the reckless emotional theater my relatives performed. At precisely 10:40 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated against the polished glass of my desk. A stark banner notification flashed across the screen, indicating motion detected in the primary bedroom. My pulse quickened, but my hands remained steady. I closed my shipping spreadsheets and opened the surveillance application. The screen refreshed, pulling up a crystal-clear, color-saturated live feed of my private sanctuary. The reinforced deadbolt had held strong, but Tyler had bypassed it by shattering the reinforced glass pane near the fire escape window. The feed showed him tumbling onto my hardwood floor, breathing heavily, brushing shards of glass from his dark hoodie. The bespoke tailoring he wore to the funeral was gone, replaced by the chaotic attire of a common thief. He looked pale, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting a trap to spring. He did not care about my electronics or the meager jewelry on my dresser. He marched straight past the television and the laptops. His target was singular. He moved into the bedroom and began ripping through my belongings with frantic entitlement. He swept a row of books off the shelf, the heavy spines hitting the floor with dull thuds. He tossed my clothes out of the closet, tearing garments off their hangers, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. He was treating my home with the same callous disregard he had shown the fertile soil of our grandfather's farm. Then his eyes locked onto the small fireproof safe perched on the top shelf. A distorted grin spread across his face, a look of feverish triumph. He reached up and dragged the heavy box down, letting it crash onto the foot of my bed. He pulled a short steel crowbar from his jacket pocket and began prying at the seams of the lock. He truly believed he was inches away from erasing my legal authority, convinced he could tear up a piece of paper and make his federal nightmare disappear. I did not rush out of my office building. I did not text him to stop. I picked up my desk phone, dialed the non-emergency dispatch line for the Chicago Police Department, and requested immediate assistance for a burglary in progress at my address. The dispatcher asked if I was in danger. I calmly replied that I was safe at my workplace, watching the intruder on a live feed, and that he was currently attempting to pry open a safe with a metal tool. The dispatcher noted my location details and promised officers were 3 minutes away. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, and watched the silent monitor. Tyler was struggling. The crowbar slipped, scraping his knuckles. He cursed, his face contorting in frustration, kicking the edge of my bed frame. He operated under the fatal assumption that I kept the original irrevocable trust in a cheap bedroom safe. He had no idea that Mitchell Grant had secured the authentic, court-stamped documents inside a subterranean bank vault, shielded by foot-thick steel and armed guards. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the apartment windows just 4 minutes after my call. Tyler did not notice the glow. He was too consumed by his destructive task. On the hallway feed, I watched 2 uniformed officers stack up beside my shattered fire escape window. They moved with swift, tactical precision. The lead officer kicked the remaining glass clear and stepped through the frame, his service weapon drawn, shouting a booming command for the intruder to drop the tool and show his hands. On the bedroom camera, Tyler froze. The crowbar slipped from his grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp clank. He raised his hands, his face draining of all color, terror etching deep lines around his eyes. He stumbled backward, stammering, his voice caught in his throat. I could not hear the audio, but his lips formed desperate, frantic words. He was trying to explain that it was a family misunderstanding. He gestured wildly around the ruined room, pointing to framed photos on the wall, attempting to prove he was the brother of the homeowner. The officers were entirely unimpressed by his lineage. A burglary suspect standing in a shattered room with a crowbar and a battered safe did not warrant a polite conversation. They commanded him to lay face down on the floor. When Tyler hesitated, paralyzed by the collapse of his reality, the officers moved in, forcing him to the ground. They pulled his arms behind his back, the metal handcuffs ratcheting tight around his wrists. The golden child who had spent his entire life evading consequences was finally pinned under the weight of the law. They hauled him to his feet and marched him out of my bedroom. I switched the feed to the lobby entrance camera. The officers escorted Tyler through the pristine glass doors of my building out onto the busy downtown street. The poetic justice of the moment was breathtaking. Tyler had parked his secondary vehicle right in front of a fire hydrant. It was a leased high-end SUV, the last remaining symbol of his unearned status. However, standing beside the SUV was a city parking enforcement officer, and backing up to the bumper was a municipal tow truck. Because Tyler's financial accounts were frozen by federal order, the lease payments had bounced, triggering an automatic recovery alert. As the police officers read Tyler his Miranda rights, the tow truck operator secured the chains around the axles of the luxury vehicle. Tyler watched in handcuffed silence as his final asset was hoisted into the air and towed away. He had walked blindly into my trap, attempting to steal a worthless document only to lose his freedom and his last shred of dignity simultaneously. I closed the surveillance application, a profound sense of closure washing over me. My toxic brother was neutralized, sitting in the back of a squad car heading toward a felony booking. The immediate threat to my physical safety was gone, but before I could return to my logistics spreadsheets, my desk phone rang. It was not a local number. The caller ID displayed the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Estates. The small battles were over, but the war against the billionaire developer was about to escalate into a terrifying new phase. The sharp ringing of my desk phone broke the quiet satisfaction of watching my brother's felony arrest play out on my surveillance feed. The caller ID displayed a shielded corporate exchange, a sequence of digits originating from the upper echelons of the Chicago business district. I answered, keeping my voice strictly neutral. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the senior executive assistant to the chief executive officer of Vanguard Estates. Her tone was clipped, lacking any warmth, presenting a demand thinly disguised as an invitation. She instructed me to arrive at their downtown corporate headquarters at precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon. She mandated that Mitchell Grant attend alongside me. The underlying message required no translation. The billionaire developer was furious, cornered by my emergency injunction, and he was summoning me to his fortress to dictate the terms of my surrender. I contacted Mitchell, who agreed to meet me in the lobby of the Vanguard building. The drive through the heart of the financial sector felt like navigating a concrete canyon. The Vanguard Estate's headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of a gleaming modern skyscraper overlooking the vast expanse of Lake Michigan. Entering the ground floor lobby was akin to stepping into a sterilized, temperature-controlled vacuum designed to intimidate outsiders. The floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the harsh architectural lighting. Security personnel in tailored suits scrutinized my identification card before granting me access to the private executive elevators. Mitchell stood near the gleaming steel doors, holding his signature leather briefcase, his expression a mask of calculating calm. He gave me a single approving nod, a silent acknowledgement that we were walking into the lion's den. The high-speed elevator whisked us upward, the pressure dropping as we ascended to the penthouse level. The polished metal doors slid open to reveal a boardroom that spanned the entire width of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the urban sprawl below, a visual reminder of the power wielded within these walls. A 60-foot mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Victor Price sat at the far end, refusing to stand or offer a greeting as we entered. He was flanked by 3 corporate attorneys, their expensive suits mirroring their predatory posture. The climate control hummed a low freezing note. Price gestured toward the empty chairs opposite him, his eyes locked onto my face with a cold, unyielding glare. He intended to diminish me, to make me feel small and insignificant in the shadow of his empire. Price skipped the standard pleasantries, launching directly into a calculated psychological assault. He leaned his elbows on the polished wood, his voice a low, threatening rumble. He dismissed my emergency injunction as a minor, irritating nuisance, a temporary roadblock his firm would obliterate before the end of the week. He promised to unleash an army of litigators to drag the estate dispute through probate and civil courts for the next 2 decades. He painted a terrifying picture of my future, describing a war of attrition, where I would drown in exorbitant legal fees fighting a conglomerate possessing unlimited financial resources. He assured me he would bleed my savings dry, forcing me to sell off my own assets just to keep a retainer on a lawyer. When the threat of financial ruin did not make me flinch, Price pivoted to a deeply personal attack. He casually dropped the name of the logistics firm where I currently worked, a clear indication he had dispatched private investigators to dig into my background. He smiled, a chilling reptilian curving of his lips that sent a shiver down my spine. He suggested that my corporate directors might frown upon employing an analyst embroiled in a high-profile land fraud investigation. He implied with ruthless subtlety that he could fabricate a scandal, whisper the right rumors into the ears of his industry contacts, and ensure my career was terminated before the end of the fiscal quarter. He wanted to strip away my livelihood, leaving me isolated and desperate. To finalize his trap, Price slid a crisp printed check across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. It came to rest inches from my folded hands. I glanced at the amount. He was offering a mere fraction of the original $4 million sale price. A lowball settlement intended to make me walk away, drop the legal injunction, and hand over the rights to my grandfather's heritage soil. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He advised me to be smart, take the money, and disappear back into my quiet, unremarkable life. He assumed I was a naive, frightened woman, easily cowed by a billionaire's posturing and a stack of cash. My pulse maintained a steady, even rhythm. My hands resting on my lap remained perfectly still. I looked at the printed check, then raised my gaze to meet Price's expectant face. As a supply chain analyst, my entire profession revolved around identifying hidden weaknesses in complex global logistical networks. I hunted for bottlenecks, compliance failures, and structural vulnerabilities. Over the weekend, while my toxic family unraveled and Vanguard mobilized their demolition crews, I had not rested. I had applied my professional expertise to the developer's corporate footprint. I had pulled every public filing, every municipal blueprint, and every zoning application Vanguard Estates had submitted to the county for the riverbed project. I cross-referenced their construction timelines with state and federal agricultural regulations. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and Victor Price, in his arrogant haste to outmaneuver a rival developer, had forged a chain riddled with fatal illegal flaws. Mitchell sat silently beside me, refusing to intervene, knowing I possessed the exact ammunition required to dismantle the man sitting across from us. I reached into my professional tote bag and withdrew a thick, spiral-bound dossier I had compiled over the past 48 hours. I deliberately pushed his settlement check aside, letting it flutter toward the edge of the table. I slid my own documentation forward. The heavy folder stopped precisely in front of Price's folded hands. I kept my voice entirely detached, delivering the facts with icy, uncompromising precision. I instructed him to open the folder and review the highlighted sections on the first page. One of his attorneys reached for the document, but Price raised a hand, stopping him. The billionaire flipped the cover open, his confident smirk faltering slightly as he took in the sheer volume of data I had gathered. I pointed out that the 300 acres in question directly bordered a protected Illinois waterway. To break ground on that specific topography, federal law mandated a rigorous Environmental Protection Agency assessment. It was a stringent, highly regulated protocol designed to prevent corporate construction runoff from poisoning local aquatic ecosystems and neighboring agricultural water supplies. The process required months of soil testing, habitat surveys, and public hearings before a single shovel could pierce the earth. There were no exemptions, no loopholes, and no shortcuts for protected riverbeds. I referenced the highlighted municipal logs in the dossier. I explained that Vanguard's internal timelines, which they had filed with the county clerk, proved they had fast-tracked the demolition phase without securing a single EPA clearance document. In his desperation to beat his competitor to the site, Price had authorized his crews to tear up protected soil without federal oversight. He had bypassed the United States government to save a few weeks on a construction calendar. I let the reality sink into the silent, freezing boardroom. I had caught a billionaire committing catastrophic environmental fraud. I informed Price that if I forwarded my dossier to the federal regulatory boards, the resulting fines would bankrupt the suburban project overnight. Furthermore, the EPA would place a permanent, multi-year freeze on every single Vanguard development across the state of Illinois, pending a full corporate audit. The smug superiority melted off Price's face, replaced by a pale, sickening dread. His attorneys shifted nervously in their expensive chairs, leaning in to read the damning evidence, realizing their boss had handed a loaded weapon to the enemy. The billionaire developer realized he was not fighting a sentimental heir. He was facing a logistical expert who had just uncovered a fatal flaw in his empire. The boardroom descended into a thick, suffocating tension, the balance of power shifting so rapidly it left the executives speechless, setting the stage for a desperate, unprecedented countermeasure. Sitting at the edge of the polished mahogany table, looking at the defeated executives, my mind drifted away from the freezing corporate fortress. The sterile, filtered air of the penthouse faded, replaced by the humid, heavy heat of a July afternoon in central Illinois. I was 17, wearing mud-stained boots following Hank along the dense, overgrown banks of the waterway that bordered the eastern edge of our property. He knelt in the tall grass, plunging his bare hands into the dark, fragrant loam. He let the rich soil sift slowly through his calloused fingers, examining the texture with profound reverence. He told me the earth here held a unique power, harboring a fragile ecosystem older than the state itself. He warned me, his voice carrying a rare, stern gravity. He said the federal authorities guarded this specific water system with an iron fist. He instructed me to treat the riverbed with profound respect because if anyone ever tried to disrupt its natural course without permission, the government would devour them whole. Hank's wisdom, imparted during a simple summer chore, had morphed into an impenetrable legal shield. I pulled my focus back to the present reality of the Chicago boardroom. Victor Price sat slumped in his ergonomic chair, the fight permanently drained from his posture. His expensive attorneys stared at their polished leather shoes, unable to mount a defense against a recorded felony bribe. The balance of power rested entirely in my hands. The ticking of the brass pocket watch in my coat served as a steady mechanical reminder that my grandfather was still guiding me, even from beyond the grave. I pushed the lowball settlement check back across the polished wood. The slip of paper glided smoothly, coming to a halt against Price's folded hands. I informed him I had no interest in his hush money. My legacy was not for sale, at any price. I outlined my first condition with icy precision. Vanguard Estates would draft a permanent, binding relinquishment of any claim to the 300 acres. The deed would return to the irrevocable trust without further dispute. Furthermore, his firm would cover all restorative landscaping costs for the damaged fencing and the disrupted soil caused by his rogue demolition crew. Price nodded slowly, his eyes lacking their former predatory gleam. The financial burden of planting a few trees and fixing a wooden fence was a trivial inconvenience compared to the looming threat of federal racketeering charges. He signaled his lead counsel with a weary flick of his wrist, instructing the man to begin drafting the surrender documents immediately. The rhythmic clicking of laptop keys filled the silent room as the lawyer frantically began to type up the terms of their defeat. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. The second condition required a different kind of ruthlessness. Price wanted his missing $4 million recovered. He was currently staring at a staggering deficit, and his shareholders would demand strict accountability for the vanishing capital. I provided the exact solution to his problem. I told him precisely where his funds had gone. I laid out the routing structure, explaining how Stephen Carroll and Tyler Ferguson had divided the windfall to fund their superficial lives. I explained that the current federal freeze was a temporary hold triggered by the initial injunction. However, Vanguard Estates possessed a legion of litigators, a formidable corporate weapon designed to extract wealth and force compliance. I ordered the billionaire to aim his legal arsenal directly at my own family. I instructed him to sue Stephen and Carroll for fraud, breach of contract, and deliberate deception. Price looked up, genuine shock registering on his face. The cold, calculated developer expected me to shield my bloodline, assuming the ties of kinship would soften my demands. Instead, I was actively redirecting his wrath onto the very people who raised me. He asked, his voice laced with pure disbelief, why I would hand my own parents over to his corporate machine. He could not fathom the depth of the betrayal required to provoke such a response. I kept my expression neutral, refusing to let any lingering grief surface under the fluorescent lights. I explained my reasoning with cold, logistical logic. They forged a legal document to steal my grandfather's legacy. They treated my existence as a convenient afterthought, tossing me a box of junk while they pocketed millions. I refused to spend a single dime of my own inheritance fighting them in civil court. I informed Price that he would do the dirty work for me. His attorneys would liquidate their pristine suburban home. They would drain their retirement accounts. They would seize whatever assets Tyler had managed to hide before his felony arrest. Price would serve as the uncompromising instrument of their financial ruin. A slow, dark understanding dawned in the billionaire's eyes. He recognized the sheer tactical brilliance of the strategy. He could recover his lost capital, avoid a disastrous environmental scandal, and escape federal prison for attempted bribery. I would walk away with my farm, free and clear, while my toxic relatives bore the full, unyielding force of his corporate vengeance. Price agreed without hesitation. The enemy of my enemy had just become my most devastating tactical asset. The next hour passed in a blur of focused legal maneuvering. Mitchell Grant reviewed every clause, every addendum, and every footnote of the surrender documents. He ensured Vanguard Estates left zero loopholes, cementing my undisputed ownership of the land. When Mitchell finally nodded his approval, Price signed the paperwork, his signature a frantic scrawl that signaled the end of his suburban development dream. I signed my name below his, officially reclaiming the heritage soil. As I slid the pen back across the table, my cell phone vibrated deep within my pocket. The sudden motion disrupted the quiet finality of the boardroom. I pulled the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my mother. Stephen and Carol were unaware of the boardroom deal that had just transpired. They did not know Vanguard Estates had abandoned the land and turned its predatory focus onto them. The message was demanding, urgent, and laced with a new, disturbing tone of authority. They demanded a meeting at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. The text indicated they possessed leverage, a final, desperate ultimatum designed to force my compliance before the federal freeze became permanent. The corporate battle was won, but the toxic family I had just targeted was planning one last vicious strike before the billionaire's lawyers descended upon them. I locked my screen, the glow fading to black. The final confrontation was inescapable. Mitchell Grant's digital recorder sat on the polished mahogany table, a small silver rectangle that held the power to destroy an empire. The atmosphere in the penthouse boardroom had shifted from predatory arrogance to suffocating terror. Victor Price, the billionaire developer, accustomed to steamrolling over legal technicalities, was pinned under the weight of his own hubris. His high-priced corporate attorneys were silent, their legal expertise useless against a recorded felony bribe. The air conditioning hummed the only sound in the freezing silence. I looked across the vast expanse of the table, my posture rigid, my mind racing. The corporate battle was won, but the war for my grandfather's legacy required a final, decisive maneuver. My cell phone resting in my coat pocket alongside Hank's ticking pocket watch vibrated with another urgent text message from my mother. Stephen and Carol were demanding a clandestine meeting on the outskirts of the city, wielding a desperate ultimatum. They thought they possessed leverage, unaware that the billionaire they had defrauded was currently surrendering his entire claim to the land. They were planning one last vicious strike, a final attempt to extort the true owner before the federal freeze became permanent. The notification served as a stark reminder that simply reclaiming the farm was insufficient. I needed to neutralize the toxic threat of my own bloodline, and I needed to do it without spending a single dime of my inheritance on civil litigation. I leaned forward, folding my hands over the environmental dossier. I addressed Victor Price, keeping my voice stripped of all emotion, delivering the terms of his surrender with icy precision. I informed him that the digital recording of his attempted bribe would remain secured in Mitchell Grant's subterranean bank vault alongside the original irrevocable trust documents. The recording would not be forwarded to the federal prosecutor, provided Vanguard Estates adhered strictly to two non-negotiable conditions. Price nodded slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The prospect of avoiding a federal racketeering investigation clearly outweighed any financial loss he was about to incur. He signaled his lead counsel with a weary flick of his wrist, authorizing the attorney to draft the necessary paperwork. My first condition was absolute and permanent. Vanguard Estates would execute a binding relinquishment of any and all claims to the 300 acres in central Illinois. The fraudulent deed generated by my parents' forged power of attorney would be legally voided, returning the title entirely to the irrevocable trust. Furthermore, the developer would cover all restorative landscaping costs, repairing the damaged wooden fences, and rehabilitating the soil disrupted by his rogue demolition crew. The heritage soil would be protected in perpetuity, safe from any future corporate incursions. The lead attorney began typing frantically, the rapid clicking of keys filling the silent room. Price agreed without hesitation, eager to shed the toxic asset that had brought his empire to the brink of federal scrutiny. The financial burden of planting a few trees and fixing a fence was a trivial inconvenience compared to the looming threat of prison. I waited until the typing stopped before outlining my second condition. This requirement demanded a different kind of ruthlessness. It required me to weaponize the very corporate machine that had tried to pave over my legacy. Price was staring at a staggering $4 million deficit. His shareholders and corporate board would demand strict accountability for the vanishing capital. He needed a scapegoat, a target to absorb the financial blow and satisfy his investors. I provided the exact solution to his problem. I told Price that if he wanted his missing capital recovered, he would unleash his legion of litigators directly onto Stephen and Carol Ferguson. I instructed him to sue my parents for massive fraud, breach of contract, and deliberate deception. I laid out the routing structure of the stolen funds, explaining how they had divided the windfall to fund their superficial lives and finance Tyler's luxury purchases. I actively redirected the billionaire's ruthless legal arsenal away from myself, aiming it squarely at the people who had raised me. Price looked up, genuine shock registering on his face. The cold, calculated developer expected me to shield my family, assuming the ties of kinship would soften my demands. He could not fathom the depth of the betrayal required to provoke such a response. He asked, his voice laced with pure disbelief, why I would hand my own parents over to his corporate machine, knowing they would be utterly destroyed by the ensuing litigation. I kept my expression neutral, refusing to let any lingering grief surface under the fluorescent lights. I explained my reasoning with cold, logistical logic. They forged a legal document to steal my grandfather's legacy. They treated my existence as a convenient afterthought, tossing me a box of junk while they pocketed millions. I refused to spend a single dime of my own inheritance fighting them in civil court. I informed Price that he would do the dirty work for me. His attorneys would liquidate their pristine suburban home. They would drain their retirement accounts. They would seize whatever assets Tyler had managed to hide before his felony arrest. Price would serve as the uncompromising instrument of their financial ruin. A slow, dark understanding dawned in the billionaire's eyes. He recognized the sheer tactical brilliance of the strategy. He could recover his lost capital, avoid a disastrous environmental scandal, and escape federal prison for attempted bribery. I would walk away with my farm, free and clear, while my toxic relatives bore the full, unyielding force of his corporate vengeance. Price agreed without hesitation. The enemy of my enemy had just become my most devastating tactical asset. The next hour passed in a blur of focused legal maneuvering. Mitchell Grant reviewed every clause, every addendum, and every footnote of the surrender documents. He ensured Vanguard Estates left zero loopholes, cementing my undisputed ownership of the land. When Mitchell finally nodded his approval, Price signed the paperwork, his signature a frantic scrawl that signaled the end of his suburban development dream. I signed my name below his, officially reclaiming the heritage soil. As I slid the pen back across the table, my cell phone vibrated again. The demanding text from my mother flashed across the screen, reiterating the location of the clandestine coffee shop meeting. The corporate battle was won, but the final personal confrontation awaited. I locked my screen, the glow fading to black. I gathered the environmental dossier, slipping the heavy folder into my professional tote bag. Mitchell secured the surrender documents in his leather briefcase. We walked out of the penthouse boardroom, leaving the billionaire developer to contemplate the wreckage of his ambition. The sterile, filtered air of the corporate fortress gave way to the crisp, unforgiving reality of the Chicago streets. I was prepared to meet my parents, armed not with legal threats or corporate muscle, but with the undeniable, devastating truth of their own destruction. The atmosphere in the penthouse boardroom felt incredibly heavy, a dense silence that only follows a total surrender. The surrender documents from Vanguard Estates were signed, the ink stark and binding against the crisp white paper. I possessed the legal right to my grandfather's 300 acres. Victor Price, the billionaire developer, sat defeated, having agreed to turn his corporate legal machine against my parents to recover his stolen $4 million. But as I gathered my environmental dossier and prepared to leave, a final, crucial detail gnawed at my analytical mind. The deal secured the land, but it did not account for the damage already inflicted. I paused, leaving the heavy manila folder on the polished mahogany table. I looked at Price, whose posture remained slumped, defeated by his own hubris. I informed him that our transaction was not yet complete. I reminded the executive of the destruction I had witnessed that morning. His demolition crew had not merely trespassed, they had illegally bulldozed 3 acres of the heritage apple orchard before the emergency injunction forced them to stop. That orchard was not just a collection of timber. It was a specialized, generational agricultural asset meticulously cultivated by Hank for decades. I stated my final condition with the cold precision of a supply chain auditor calculating unrecoverable losses. I demanded a $1 million restitution fee for the unauthorized destruction of protected agricultural property. The demand echoed sharply against the glass walls of the boardroom. Price's lead attorney opened his mouth to protest the exorbitant figure, ready to argue the market value of fruit trees. I did not let the lawyer finish his sentence. I tapped a manicured fingernail against the cover of my environmental dossier. I reminded them that the alternative to this restitution was federal exposure. If I reported the illegal demolition on protected riverbed soil to the Environmental Protection Agency, the resulting fines would eclipse $1 million before the end of the month, not to mention the permanent freeze on their entire state portfolio. I framed the penalty not as a negotiation, but as an incredibly inexpensive insurance policy against their own catastrophic negligence. Price closed his eyes, the fight permanently extinguished from his spirit. He knew the math. He recognized a checkmate when he saw one. He gestured weakly to his legal counsel. The attorney pulled a corporate checkbook from a leather briefcase, his hands moving with reluctant, precise efficiency. He drafted the draft for $1 million. The sum, spelling out a brutal penalty for their corporate arrogance. Price signed the document, his signature a frantic scrawl, handing over a fortune to the woman he had tried to arrest just hours prior. I accepted the check, slipping the fortune into my tote bag alongside the surrender documents and the environmental dossier. Mitchell Grant, my ruthless attorney, gave me a single approving nod, a silent acknowledgement of a perfectly executed legal strike. We walked out of the Vanguard Estates headquarters, the high-speed elevator whisking us away from the sterile, filtered air of the corporate fortress. I stepped onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk, the crisp autumn wind carrying the chaotic energy of the city. I was no longer an inconvenient afterthought fighting for a patch of dirt. I was a millionaire landowner who had just brought a corporate empire to its knees. The immediate aftermath of the boardroom deal was swift and devastating. True to his word, Victor Price unleashed his legion of litigators. The very next morning, federal process servers arrived at the sprawling, pristine colonial home in the Naperville suburbs. My parents, Stephen and Carol, were served with a mountain of catastrophic legal paperwork. Vanguard Estates officially filed a massive lawsuit for wire fraud, breach of contract, and deliberate deception, seeking the immediate recovery of the $4 million, plus extensive punitive damages. The digital freeze on their assets transformed into a permanent, suffocating vice. Their luxury credit lines were severed. The bank seized their pristine suburban home, citing the fraudulent transfer as grounds for immediate foreclosure. The performative superiority they had weaponized on their sun-drenched patio shattered completely. They were trapped, isolated, and facing the terrifying reality of federal indictments. They desperately needed an airtight legal defense, a miracle, to save them from lengthy prison sentences. But their golden child, the son they had enriched at my expense, was utterly powerless to assist them. Tyler was currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell in downtown Chicago, facing felony burglary charges for breaking into my apartment. He had no access to his frozen bank accounts. The repossession company had already towed his luxury sports car and his leased SUV. He could not afford bail, let alone a competent defense attorney. The fake real estate titan who had boasted about his $4 million windfall at an exclusive country club was now eating institutional food and wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. The arrogant family that had sold my heritage for cash was facing total financial and legal obliteration, orchestrated entirely by their own greed and the daughter they had cruelly underestimated. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, watching the morning news cycle on my tablet. A minor headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen, noting a sudden restructuring at Vanguard Estates due to unforeseen zoning complications in central Illinois. The billionaire had buried the scandal, absorbing the loss to protect his empire. The corporate machine continued to churn, oblivious to the provincial drama that had nearly derailed it. My phone vibrated, interrupting the quiet satisfaction of the moment. The caller ID displayed the name of the clandestine coffee shop my mother had texted me about the previous day. I had ignored their frantic demands for a meeting, prioritizing the destruction of Victor Price's leverage. Now, with the legal trap permanently sprung on my family, I felt a curious, detached necessity to close the final loop. I answered the call, my voice devoid of any warmth or familial obligation. Carol's voice cracked over the line, brittle and thick with terror. She did not yell. She did not attempt to manipulate or gaslight me. She sounded hollow, broken by the sheer velocity of the corporate assault I had directed toward her doorstep. She informed me that federal agents were currently cataloging the assets in their home. She pleaded for a brief conversation, begging for a chance to explain, a final attempt to salvage a relationship she had spent 3 decades destroying. The corporate battle was won, the legal vengeance secured. But the personal severance required a final, definitive closure before I could truly begin building my legacy on my grandfather's soil. I agreed to meet my mother at a bleak, impersonal diner situated halfway between the city limits and the sprawling suburbs. I arrived early, securing a corner booth, ordering a black coffee. I watched through the smudged window as Carol pulled into the parking lot. She drove a rented compact sedan, a stark downgrade from the luxury vehicle the bank had repossessed just 48 hours prior. She walked through the diner doors, her shoulders hunched, her gaze darting around the room, as if expecting federal agents to step out from the kitchen. The designer armor she usually wore was gone. She looked frail, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined her entire adult life. She slid into the booth opposite me, her hands trembling so fiercely she had to clasp them together on the sticky laminate table. She did not order anything. She launched into a frantic, breathless monologue, spinning a desperate narrative of victimhood. She claimed Stephen had forced her to sign the fraudulent documents, insisting she never wanted to sell Hank's property. She weaponized her tears, begging me to call off Vanguard Estates to intercede with Victor Price on their behalf. She asked how a daughter could stand by and watch her own flesh and blood face total ruin. I let her exhaust her frantic script. I sipped my coffee, the bitter liquid grounding me. When she finally paused to draw a ragged breath, I leaned forward. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm. I told her that Victor Price was merely a mirror reflecting their own greed back onto them. I reminded her of the afternoon on her sun-drenched patio when she laughed at my grief and threatened to call the police on me. I stated that true family protects one another, whereas she had treated my existence as a disposable liability. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a $1 bill, and set it on the table to cover my coffee. I looked into her tear-filled eyes and delivered the final, undeniable truth. I told her the woman sitting across from her was not her daughter. I was the legal owner of a 300-acre estate they tried to steal. Then I stood up and walked out of the diner. I did not look back. The psychological tether that bound me to their toxicity snapped, leaving me feeling lighter than air. The severing was final. 6 months passed. The bitter chill of winter gave way to the vibrant, healing warmth of a Midwestern spring, which eventually transitioned into a brilliant, golden autumn. The Illinois landscape transformed into a breathtaking tapestry of amber russet and deep crimson. I stood on the wraparound porch of the old farmhouse, breathing in the crisp air, the scent of ripe fruit and rich overturned soil filling my lungs. The terrifying roar of corporate earth movers was a distant, fading memory. In its place, the steady, rhythmic hum of green tractors echoed across the fields, a soothing, mechanical heartbeat of honest labor. The $1 million restitution fee extracted from the billionaire developer did not sit idle in a bank account. I deployed the capital with the precision of a seasoned logistics expert. I utilized the funds to repair the damaged fencing, aerate the compressed soil, and expand the heritage apple orchard. More importantly, I reimagined my grandfather's traditional farming model. I stepped away from my corporate desk job in the city and applied my supply chain expertise directly to the earth. I established Hank's Heritage Co-op, a sustainable, high-yield agribusiness. Instead of selling wholesale crops for pennies on the dollar to vast distribution centers, I created a direct pipeline to the top culinary establishments in Chicago. I leveraged my professional network to secure exclusive contracts with high-end restaurants that valued organic, locally sourced produce. The farm transformed into a highly profitable enterprise, cutting out the middlemen and maximizing the return on every single acre. The dirt my parents deemed useless was currently generating a staggering, sustainable revenue stream. I hired local hands, men and women who used to work alongside Hank, ensuring the local economy thrived alongside my own fields. The contrast between my flourishing reality and the bleak existence of the people who tried to ruin me was stark. The consequences of their fraud had settled over them like a concrete shroud. Stephen and Carol failed to mount a successful defense against Vanguard Estates. The corporate litigators systematically dismantled their suburban life. The bank foreclosed on the Naperville home. Their retirement accounts were liquidated to satisfy the civil judgments. They filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy, forced to relocate into a cramped, noisy apartment complex situated next to a roaring interstate highway. The elite social circles they had worshipped discarded them the moment their bank accounts froze. Tyler suffered a grim fate. The golden child's frantic burglary attempt resulted in a felony conviction. With no financial resources to secure a plea deal, he was sentenced to a mandatory term in a state correctional facility. The man who used to boast about his bespoke tailoring and expensive bourbon was currently wearing a state-issued uniform assigned to laundry duty in a sterile institutional cafeteria. His unearned pride evaporated the second the heavy iron doors locked behind him. Their collective greed had forged the very chains that bound them. I turned my gaze away from the horizon and looked down at my hand. My fingers brushed over the smooth brass casing of Hank's vintage pocket watch. I wound the small dial at the top, feeling the internal spring tighten, listening to the crisp, methodical ticking. The sound was no longer a frantic countdown to destruction. It was a steady, enduring rhythm of triumph. I walked down the wooden steps of the porch, my boots crunching softly against the gravel driveway. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the fields. A delivery truck, bearing the vibrant logo of my cooperative, was pulling out of the loading bay, heading north toward the city to fulfill a lucrative restaurant order. The driver waved as he passed, a gesture of genuine respect. I walked toward the east field, stopping beside the oldest apple tree on the property. The branches were heavy with ripe fruit, the bark scarred but unbroken. This was the exact spot where I had stood my ground against a towering machine, risking everything to protect a memory. I reached out and rested my palm against the rough wood. I had not merely salvaged a piece of real estate. I had outmaneuvered a corporate titan, neutralized a toxic bloodline, and forged an empire of my own design. I looked out over the sprawling, beautiful expanse of my undisputed legacy, feeling a profound, unshakable peace. The farm was safe, the future was secure, and I had finally come home. The story of Emily Ferguson is a masterclass in the destructive power of entitlement and the breathtaking resilience of a woman who refused to be erased. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality that the very people tasked with protecting and nurturing us are sometimes the architects of our deepest pain. The betrayal Emily faced wasn't just financial. It was fundamentally emotional. A complete devaluation of her existence in favor of a golden child and superficial status. As I reflect on Emily's journey, I am struck by the catastrophic failure of parenting that set this entire tragedy into motion. Stephen and Carol's parenting model was built on a foundation of toxicity and favoritism. They raised Tyler, their golden child, with a dangerous lack of accountability. They funded his reckless ventures, shielded him from the consequences of his failures, and ultimately committed federal wire fraud to sustain his unearned lifestyle. This is the antithesis of responsible parenting. It's an exercise in ego projection, a desperate attempt to mold a child into a status symbol, rather than guiding them toward self-sufficiency and integrity. True parenting, the kind that fosters resilience and authentic success, requires the difficult work of imposing boundaries and allowing children to experience the consequences of their actions. It demands fairness and emotional awareness, an unwavering commitment to treating every child with respect, regardless of whether they conform to parental expectations. Stephen and Carol completely failed in this regard. They viewed Emily, a diligent and independent woman, as an inconvenient afterthought, a mere instrument to be utilized and discarded when she ceased to be useful to their twisted narrative. The story underscores a crucial lesson in American family dynamics. Loyalty cannot be demanded. It must be earned through mutual respect and consistent honesty. When Stephen and Carol attempted to manipulate Emily into signing a retroactive quitclaim deed, weaponizing the concept of family duty, they exposed the hollowness of their bond. They expected unconditional sacrifice from a daughter they had treated with absolute contempt. Emily's refusal to commit perjury, her unyielding adherence to the truth, stands as a powerful rebuke to this toxic entitlement. She recognized that true family does not demand illegal complicity or emotional subjugation. Emily's grandfather, Hank, emerges as the true parental figure in this narrative, even in his absence. He saw beyond the superficiality of Stephen and Carol and recognized Emily's genuine connection to the land and the values it represented. His decision to place the farm in an irrevocable trust was not merely a legal maneuver. It was an act of profound love and foresight. It was a father's final attempt to protect his legacy and his granddaughter from the destructive greed of his own son. Hank understood that long-term guidance sometimes means making difficult choices to ensure that the things we value most, integrity, hard work, and the preservation of our heritage, are entrusted to those who possess the character to uphold them. In our own lives, we often find ourselves entangled in relationships, familial, romantic, or professional, that demand we shrink ourselves to fit into spaces designed by others. We compromise our boundaries, swallow insults, and tolerate disrespect in the name of keeping the peace or fulfilling an expected role. Naomi's decade-long performance as the quiet, unassuming wife in the face of Preston's arrogance is a poignant example of this dynamic. She silenced her true identity to prove she could be loved for her character, only to discover that shrinking herself invited exploitation rather than genuine affection. The moment of reckoning for both Emily and Naomi comes when the illusion of safety shatters. For Emily, it was the discovery of the fraudulent sale. For Naomi, it was the physical and emotional brutality of her husband at the anniversary gala. These traumatic events served as catalysts, stripping away the masks and forcing them to confront the stark reality of their circumstances. They did not respond with chaotic vengeance. Instead, they reclaimed their power through cold, calculated precision. They weaponized the truth, using the very arrogance of their oppressors as the instrument of their downfall. Their victories are deeply satisfying because they are rooted in authentic empowerment. They did not simply dismantle the empires built by those who betrayed them. They established their own legacies. Emily saved her grandfather's farm, transforming it into a sustainable agribusiness. Naomi secured her position as an executive powerhouse, utilizing her wealth to create a sanctuary for women escaping abuse. They proved that our value is not determined by those who fail to see it, but by our own willingness to stand firmly in our truth. This narrative compels us to evaluate our own lives. Where are we accepting false narratives? Where are we allowing toxic people to exploit our vulnerabilities? Empowerment begins the moment we stop prioritizing the fragile egos of others over our own self-worth. It begins when we realize that survival is merely a baseline. True victory lies in reclaiming our identity and building an unshakable foundation of respect. If you found value in this story, I encourage you to follow Zara Told Stories for more narratives that explore the complexities of human relationships and the power of resilience. Perhaps the most profound realization is that the family we are born into does not always define the family we choose to build. We are taught that blood is the strongest bond, that family is an unbreakable covenant. Yet, as Emily's story demonstrates, blood can also be the justification for profound betrayal. Sometimes the most courageous act is not fighting to save a fractured relationship, but recognizing when the rot has reached the foundation and having the strength to walk away. It forces us to ask, if the cost of keeping a family together is our own erasure, is it a family worth keeping?